Last time we spoke about the fall of Shanghai. In October 1937, a small battalion led by Colonel Shi Yinuan transformed the Xi'an warehouse into a fortress against the advancing Japanese army. Becoming known as the 800 Heroes, they became symbols of hope, rallying local citizens who provided vital support. Despite heavy casualties, they held out against overwhelming odds until a strategic retreat was ordered on November the 1st. As Japanese forces intensified their assaults, they breached the Chinese defenses and captured strategic positions along the Suzhou Creek. The fighting was fierce, marked by desperate counterattacks from the besieged Chinese soldiers, who faced an unyielding enemy. By November the 9th, the Chinese faced a full retreat, their organized defenses collapsing into chaos as they fled the city. Desperate civilians sought refuge in the international settlement, but they were met with hostility, exacerbating the terror of the moment. Amidst the turmoil, remaining forces continued to resist in pockets, holding out as long as possible. By November the 11th, Japanese troops raised the Rising Sun flag over the last stronghold, marking a grim victory. This episode is The Crossing of Nanjing's Rubicon. Hello again, and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, my personal podcast series found on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released the third part in my series covering the Japanese invasion of North China and Inner Mongolia, this episode titled Operation Chahar. So please, if you have a second, go check it out and comment where you came from. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And over there, the latest episode was a big one. Why did Japan actually surrender during World War II? If you thought it was about 2 atomic bombs or the invasion of Manchuria, well, there might be more to it than you are led to believe. So if that's of interest to you, please go check it out. As the Japanese were mopping up in Shanghai, Chiang Kai-shek wrote in his diary on November the 11th, "I fear that they could threaten Nanjing." Over in Shanghai, General Matsue was dealing with foreign correspondents, eager to learn what Japan's next move would be, and to this he simply stated, "For future developments, you had better ask Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek." The correspondents were surprised by his response, and they pressed him further. So he replied, "Chiang Kai-shek was reported to have predicted a 5-year war. Well, it might be that long. We don't know whether we will go to Nanjing or not. It all depends on Chiang." Now at this point, Shanghai was falling under Japanese control, and now Matsue and his fellow field commanders were thinking, well, what's next? Nanjing was certainly the next objective. It was a common understanding amongst the Japanese leadership that if the 4 main eastern cities, that being Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, and Nanjing, were lost, Chiang Kai-shek's government would collapse. 3 of said cities had been taken. Nanjing was dangling like a fresh fruit. Matsue's staff believed the Chinese units departing Shanghai would mount a stand immediately west of the city, probably a defensive line running from Jiaoding to Huangjujian. On the night of November the 11th, Matsue issued a command to all units in the Shanghai area to advance west along the railway towards Nanjing. Their first objective would be a line extending from Taicang to Kunshan. Chiang Kai-shek was not only reeling from military defeats, but also the gradual loss of his German allies. The Germans were increasingly aligning with the Japanese. Chiang Kai-shek was looking for new external help, so he turned to the Soviets. It was a marriage of pure convenience. Chiang Kai-shek signed a non-aggression pact with the USSR that very year, and he wasted no time pleading for aircraft and pilots. Moscow began sending them before the ink even touched the paper. 200 aircraft and pilots in return for some essential minerals, wolfram and tungsten. The Sino-Soviet friendship even drew in an unlikely source of support, one Sir Winston Churchill. The Soviet envoy to the United Kingdom described how during a meeting with Churchill, he greatly praised our tactics in the Far East, maintenance of neutrality and simultaneous aid to China in weaponry. Soviet pilots found themselves dispatched to Nanjing, where they were briefed by one Yakov Vladimirovich Smushkevich, the deputy commander of the Soviet Air Forces. The Japanese armed forces are technically superior to the Chinese. The Chinese Air Force is a particular concern. Soviet pilots who have rushed to China's aid are currently in Nanjing. They are fighting valiantly. Meanwhile, back at Shanghai, discipline and order had characterized previous Chinese withdrawals, but this had collapsed. Simply put, there were hundreds of thousands of men trying to retreat across the lower Yangtze region. It was a complete shitstorm. Many units had to disengage during live combat with the enemy and scramble just to pull out. Wang Qingxiang, the deputy commander of the Chinese right flank in Shanghai, executed a strategic withdrawal moments before his command post succumbed to the advancing enemy forces. Just 15 minutes after his departure, the area was overrun by Japanese troops. In a desperate bid to avoid capture, another general had to cross a creek, nearly drowning in the process. Rescued while barely clinging to life and drenched in icy water, he was welcomed by a peasant family who aided in his recovery before he resumed his arduous journey westward. The scale of this withdrawal occurred both day and night. They could hardly escape the enemy's notice, as its complexity made the operation increasingly difficult. The execution of the withdrawal exacerbated the situation significantly. Orders to abandon their positions started to trickle down immediately after the upper command made the decision. However, these orders reached the units in a disorganized manner. Many telephone lines had been sabotaged, and when soldiers were sent to relay orders in person, they faced severe disruptions in transportation networks. Consequently, many units only became aware of the withdrawal when they witnessed the mass movements of their comrades heading westward. Upon realizing what was happening, many soldiers fled in a state of panic. There were no comprehensive plans outlining the retreat, no designated routes for the various units, nor any established timetables. The outcome was a chaotic scramble for survival. Soldiers who had fought side by side for 3 months suddenly found themselves competing against one another in a desperate race to escape. At bridges and other choke points, weary soldiers exhausted their last reserves of strength, brawling with their fellow troops to be the first to cross. Meanwhile, officers traveling in chauffeur-driven cars attempted to assert their ranks to gain priority access to the roads, adding to the growing disorder that ensued. The massive army was hindered by its sheer size, resulting in miles of congested roads filled with men unable to move in any direction. This made them easy targets for Japanese aircraft, leading to a bloody cycle of repeated attacks. Planes adorned with the red rising sun insignia would emerge from the horizon, swoop down, and strike at the vulnerable formations. As Commander Chen Yuding recalled, the lack of organization and the gridlocked roads resulted in far more casualties than could have been avoided. On November the 12th, the newspaper Jiangyang Ribao published an editorial addressing the citizens of Nanjing to remind them that tough times lay ahead of them now that Shanghai had fallen. The article stipulated they needed to prepare the city for the upcoming battle. Now, all the citizenry of the capital must fulfill their duty in a way that could serve as a model for the entire nation. Nanjing in 1937 was a city touched by the war, but not enough to change the social fabric just yet. Cinemas remained open, people were shopping as usual, traffic was heavy along Zhongshan Road. Order remained. Telephones remained on, except during air raids. Connections to the outside world functioned as they should, given that it was the capital after all. The region had seen some good harvests in 1937. No one was going hungry. However, as the front, over 200 miles away, drew closer, bombing raids became more frequent. Fear of the enemy increased. Contact with the outside world gradually began to decline. By mid-November, the train link from Nanjing to Shanghai was severed. As fear amongst the populace increased, so did a newfound sense of common purpose against a common enemy. Posters calling for the Chinese to unite against the Japanese invaders were found throughout Nanjing. Residents were conscripted for various fortification efforts, with some receiving basic military training to help defend the city. Those who refused to cooperate faced severe penalties and they were deemed traitors, while the majority willingly participated. Both military and civilian police were deployed throughout the city, diligently checking identities in the ongoing effort to root out spies and traitors. The authorities enforced a strict prohibition against discussing military matters in restaurants and other public venues. Then the families of all the high-ranking military officials and politicians began departing the city in secrecy. This was followed by said politicians and military officials. 'Twas not a good look. Nanjing soon saw its population decline from about 1 million to 500,000. Those who stayed behind were mainly the poor or those too anchored to leave, like shopkeepers. Every day saw a steady stream of Nanjing citizens leaving the city over her main roads, fleeing into the countryside with carts full of their belongings. On November the 12th at 10 a.m., orders were issued for the Japanese to advance west. What had been a war of attrition, where inches of land were claimed with blood, suddenly became a war of movement. As one Japanese soldier recalled, "In the course of 50 days, I had moved only 2 miles. Now suddenly we're experiencing rapid advance." As the Japanese came across small towns, they found large posters plastered all over the walls. These were all anti-Japanese, with some nationalist propaganda. The Japanese soldiers would tear them down and paint up their own messages like, "Down with Chiang Kai-shek." Towns and cities west of Shanghai fell rapidly one after another, each succumbing to a grim pattern. Swift conquest followed by widespread devastation. Jiaoding, a county seat with a population of approximately 30,000, succumbed to a prolonged siege. When the 10th Division captured Jiaoding on November the 13th, after relentless shelling had leveled a third of the city, they began a massacre, indiscriminately killing nearly everyone in their path, men, women, and children alike. The battle and its aftermath resulted in over 8,000 casualties amongst the city's residents and the surrounding countryside. One Japanese soldier referred to Jiaoding as, quote, "a city of death, in a mysteriously silent world in which the only sound was the tap of our own footsteps." On November the 14th, soldiers from the 9th Division reached Zaitang, an ancient walled city designed to withstand likely sieges. As they crossed the 70-foot moat amid some heavy fire, the Japanese troops confronted the formidable 20-foot-high city wall. After breaching the wall, the infantry swiftly entered the city and seized control. The destruction persisted long after the fighting ceased, with half of the city being devastated, including significant cultural institutions like her library and a salted grain reservoir, which were all looted. It was as if the Japanese aimed to obliterate not just the material existence of the people, but their spiritual foundation as well. Casual cruelties marked the nature of warfare along the entire front, with few prisoners being taken. Eishi Seitaro, a soldier of the 13th Division's 26th Brigade, encountered a mass execution while marching alongside the Yangtze River. Several headless corpses floated nearby, yet 3 Chinese prisoners remained alive. A Japanese officer personally overseeing the execution wore a simple uniform, but the 2 ornate swords at his belt indicated his wealthy background. Approaching one prisoner, the officer dramatically drew one of the swords and brandished it through the air with an exaggerated flare. In an almost theatrical display, he held it aloft, the blade trembling as if he were nervous. The prisoner, in stark contrast, exhibited an unnerving calmness as he knelt, awaiting his inevitable fate. The officer swung the sword down, but failed to deliver a clean strike. Although he inflicted a deep gash in the prisoner's skull, it was not fatal. The prisoner collapsed, thrashing and emitting a prolonged scream that sent chills through all of those present. The officer, seemingly exhilarated by the anguish he had just caused, began wildly slashing at the figure until the screams subsided. Ishi turned away in horror, his mind swirling with confusion. He thought to himself, why were the Chinese being executed? Had they not surrendered? 3 months into the war's expansion to the Yangtze region, air raids had become an all too frequent menace to Nanjing. The first major raid came on August 15th and increased each week. On the night of the 27th, approximately 30 bombs were dropped over Purple Mountain, specifically targeting the memorial park for Dr. Sun Yat-sen, aiming to hurt the morale of Nanjing's residents. As days melted into weeks and weeks stretched into months, the landscape of Nanjing transformed under the weight of the war. Residents began constructing dugouts in the courtyards, gardens, the public squares, and even on the streets. Foreigners painted their national flags atop of buildings and vehicles, attempting to avoid the risk of being gunned down by strafing aircraft. Each raid followed a predictable routine. Sirens wailed for about 20 to 30 minutes before the attack, signaling pedestrians to seek shelter and for drivers to stop their engines. By the time a shorter warning sounded, the streets had been cleared, leaving nothing to do but await the arrival of Japanese planes. Initially, the American-trained Chinese Air Force posed a considerable threat to Japanese bombers. The 4th and 5th Chinese squadrons stationed near Nanjing to defend the capital achieved early successes, reporting the downing of 6 bombers during the first air raid on Nanjing. Much of the credit for these aerial victories belonged to one Claire Chennault, a retired American Army Air Corps captain who had become an advisor to the Chinese Air Force, overseeing Nanjing's air defense. Chennault taught his pilots tactics that he had developed in the United States, but had never fully implemented there. His strategy was pretty straightforward. 3 fighters would focus on one enemy bomber at a time. One would attack from above, another from below, while a third would hover in reserve to deliver the final blow if necessary. He instructed the Chinese pilots to target the engines rather than the fuselage, reasoning that any missed shots could hit the gas tanks located in the wing roots. This approach proved successful, leading to the loss of 54 Japanese planes within about 3 days. For Chennault, it validated his belief that air superiority required a diverse range of aircraft and not just bombers. Nighttime raids, however, posed a much greater threat. Chennault, along with his other commanders, sought solutions. Chinese General Shi Yinuan, a German-trained artillery officer overseeing the country's anti-aircraft defenses, ensured that dozens of large spurry searchlights were positioned throughout Nanjing in a grid pattern. This setup had a dual purpose. It would dazzle the Japanese bomber crews and highlight their planes in silhouette for Chinese fighters above to target. The bravery of most skilled Chinese pilots occasionally gained media attention, making them local celebrities amidst the otherwise grim war environment. However, this bright moment faded quickly when the Japanese command decided to provide escorts for their bombers. Consequently, the elite of China's Air Force, its finest pilots and aircraft, were lost within weeks that fall. And actually, writing this segment reminds me, I did once write an episode for Kings and Generals. Over on their YouTube channel, the episode was the history of the Zero Fighter. And actually, it was the prototypes that were in development, the A5M, that were the culprits taking down these said pilots. And if you want to learn more about that, well, go check out their episode. If you want something even larger than that, over on my Patreon account, I did do a longer format podcast that went into the history much more in depth. Now, all of these air raids were brutal, but the worst assaults occurred at the end of September. As a radio broadcaster reported on September the 25th, gallons of civilian blood flowed today as Nanjing endured 3 ferocious air raids. In total, 96 Japanese sorties were launched on that very day. Witnesses observed around a dozen Chinese aircraft retreating north across Yangtze, initially believing that they were fleeing, but some returned to confront the enemy. When Chinese fighters managed to down a Japanese bomber, the streets erupted in cheers as civilians momentarily forgot their fear. The primary aim of the September 25th attack appeared to be to spread terror amongst the civilian population. Chiang Kai-shek wrote in his diary that day, "The repeated Japanese air raids over the past several days have had no impact on our military installations. Instead, civilian property has sustained significant damage." Around 20 bombs struck the Central Hospital, one of Nanjing's largest medical facilities, causing extensive destruction and prompting the evacuation of all of its staff. 2 1,000-pound bombs exploded nearby, leaving large craters. Had these bombs landed slightly closer, they could have resulted in mass casualties amongst the hospital's 100 patients, including a Japanese pilot, ironically, who had just been shot down earlier that month. The air raids at the end of September prompted protest from the American, British, and French governments to Japan. In response, Tokyo issued a statement on September the 30th, asserting that while they were not intentionally targeting non-combatants, it was unavoidable for achieving military objectives that military airfields and installations in and around Nanjing be bombed. The battle for Jiashan was amongst one of the fiercest in the southern Yangtze Delta campaign, and this happened in November of 1937. Although Jiashan was a moderately sized town straddling a crucial railway connecting Shanghai to Hangzhou, the capital of Zhejiang province, for the Japanese, seizing Jiashan was imperative for their westward advance. Without it, their military progress would be severely hampered. Jiashan had endured 3 days of relentless bombing by the Japanese Air Force, driving most residents to flee into the surrounding countryside. Only about 100 remained, those who were too old or too sick to escape, abandoned by families or friends who lacked the means to assist them. The Japanese troops brutally bayoneted nearly all of these individuals and buried them in a mass grave just outside the town's northern gate. Jiashan was captured by the 10th Army, a division fresh from victories and eager to engage in combat, unlike the weary forces of the Shanghai Expeditionary Force further to the north. With less than a week of combat experience, the 10th Army soldiers were really hungry for a fight. The martial spirit of the 10th Army was exemplified by its commander, Yanagawa Heisuke. Born near Nagasaki in 1879, he was amongst a group of retired officers who had been called back to active service after the war in China escalated unexpectedly. Having served in the Russo-Japanese War all the way back in 1904 to 1905, and he had taught at the Beijing Army College in 1918, Yanagawa had considerable experience in military affairs. However, his past exposure to China did not cultivate any empathy for the enemy. He was determined to push all the way to Nanjing, and once there, he intended to blanket the city, apparently in his words, in mustard gas and incendiaries until it capitulated. While Japanese commanders debated the value of capturing Nanjing, the Chinese were equally preoccupied with whether it was worth defending. Most military professionals viewed the situation as a lost cause from the start. After the fall of Shanghai, Chiang Kai-shek summoned one of his top commanders, Chen Cheng, to Nanjing for discussions. "How can Nanjing be held?" Chen Cheng shot back. "Are you ordering me to hold Nanjing?" Chiang Kai-shek replied, "I am not." Chen Cheng stated frankly at this point, "I believe Nanjing should not be held at all." By mid-November, Bai Changxi, one of China's most respected generals, advocated for declaring Nanjing an open city. He argued that defending it was not only unnecessary, but also impossible. All available forces had been deployed to Shanghai, and they were now exhausted. Furthermore, no reinforcements would be forthcoming if they made a stand in Nanjing. Instead of stubbornly clinging to a fixed position, he preferred a more flexible defensive strategy. Jiang Qun, Chang's secretary, supported Bai's stance, believing that while Nanjing should ultimately be abandoned, political considerations were also paramount. If the Chinese simply withdrew and allowed the Japanese to occupy the city, it would undermine China's position in any future negotiations. The Japanese would not be able to present themselves as victors who had triumphed in battle. Similarly, Chang's chief military advisor, General Alexander von Falkenhausen, was against attempting to hold Nanjing. He deemed it completely useless from a military perspective, suggesting it would be madness to defend it. Furthermore, he warned that if Chiang Kai-shek forced his army into a decisive battle with their backs to the Yangtze River, a disaster would probably be unavoidable. Chang's head of operations bureau, Liu Fei, argued Nanjing could not be abandoned without a proper fight, as it would crush the NRA's morale. He believed that defending the city could be managed with as few as 12 regiments, although 18 would be more feasible. Most at the meeting agreed, and Chang understood Nanjing's international recognition necessitated some form of defense, doomed or not. A second meeting was formed whereupon Tang Shengzhi, a general staff officer whose loyalties were, let's be honest, very flip-floppy, rose to the occasion. During the warlord era, he routinely switched sides, especially against Chiang Kai-shek. At the meeting, Tang stated in regards to Nanjing's international prominence and being the final resting place of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, "How can we face the spirit of the former president in heaven? We have no choice but to defend the capital to the death." Chang's commanders were all well aware of his intentions. The Generalissimo was eager for a dramatic last stand in Nanjing to serve for propaganda purposes, aiming to rally the nation and convey to the world that China was resolute in her fight against Japan. His commanders also recognized the rationale behind fighting for Nanjing. However, very few were inclined to embark on what was most likely a suicide mission. Within a third meeting, that occurred the day after the second, Chang openly asked, "Who is willing to shoulder the burden of defending Nanjing?" This was met with an awkward silence before Tang Shengzhi stepped forward. "Chairman, if no one else is willing, I will. I'm prepared to defend Nanjing and to hold it to the death." With zero hesitation, Chang accepted his offer. "Good, the responsibility is yours." As a little refresher, back to the warlord era, Tang Shengzhi played a critical role in Chiang Kai-shek's efforts to unify China by force in the 1920s, while the nation remained a patchwork of fiefdoms. However, the relationship had soured on two occasions, forcing Tang Shengzhi into temporary exile, the first time to Japan and the second time to Hong Kong. The Japanese invasion of northeastern China in 1931 prompted a loose reconciliation. Since then, Tang had held several important positions, notably organizing war games, simulating a Japanese assault on Nanjing. However, Tang had often suffered from illness, and crucially, he had not led troops in the field against the Japanese since the onset of the full-scale war. Hailing from Hunan province, he was a typical provincial soldier and would likely face challenges trying to command respect amongst the elite divisions loyal solely to the central government in Nanjing. He was definitely not the first choice for such a task. Amazingly, while tens of thousands of Chinese and Japanese were killing each other, while Japanese planes relentlessly bombarded Chinese cities, including the capital, and while Japanese soldiers committed heinous atrocities against Chinese civilians, the two nations maintained diplomatic relations. China had a fully operational embassy in Tokyo, led by Shi Yinuan, a 65-year-old diplomat. This surreal arrangement persisted because neither side was willing to officially declare war. In the fall of 1937, as Japanese armies were heavily engaged on two fronts within mainland China, Shi met with the Japanese Foreign Minister, Hirota Koki, to propose a non-aggression treaty. This proposal was swiftly rejected. By November of 1937, Shi was no longer at the forefront of events, and foreign observers shifted their focus from the capitals of the warring nations to Belgium. While large-scale battles raged over the lower Yangtze region, representatives from 19 countries convened in Brussels to search for a way to end hostilities. Although China participated in the conference, Japan did not. Japan had received 2 invitations to join the talks, with its response to the second arriving in Brussels on November the 12th, a firm rejection. Japan asserted that it preferred direct bilateral negotiations with China, dismissing the Brussels conference held under the auspices of the Nine-Power Treaty, a pact signed back in 1922 aimed at ensuring China's national sovereignty and her territorial integrity. Japan argued that intervention by a collective body like the conference would, quote, would merely stir national sentiments in both countries and complicate efforts to reach a mutually satisfactory resolution. The League of Nations had called for the Nine-Power Conference a month earlier, which ultimately became a 19-power conference as other nations with interests in East Asia joined. From the outset, Japan opposed the assembly and was absent when the first plenary meeting commenced in Brussels on November the 3rd. Japanese leaders feared that China might attempt to leverage the conference against Western powers, recalling how in 1895 Japan had been denied its spoils of war following its first victory over China due to the intervention of Russia, France, and Germany, who had blocked Japan from claiming the strategic Liaodong Peninsula in what was termed the Triple Intervention. China also exhibited a lukewarm attitude towards the conference. While Japan feared the potential outcomes, China was concerned about the lack of significant results. The proposal to transition discussions from the League of Nations, perceived as almost completely useless, to be honest, to the even less authoritative Nine Powers, which lacked any formal organization, well, it wasn't a good look. Nonetheless, the Chinese chose to participate in Brussels, maintaining the pretense that something meaningful could be accomplished. Shortly after Japan's second rejection of the invitation, Wellington Koo made an impassioned plea in Brussels stating this: now that the door to conciliation and mediation has been slammed in your face by the latest reply of the Japanese government, will you not decide to withhold supplies of war materials and credit to Japan and extend aid to China? However, in reality, Koo understood that significant Western aid to China was highly unlikely, aside from token gestures. Previous international discussions had momentarily halted Japanese advances in the past. For instance, in 1932, Japanese troops had paused their movements in the Shanghai area just hours before the League of Nations General Assembly commenced. But that was nearly 6 years ago, and circumstances had changed dramatically since then. Rogue states had grown bolder, while democracies seemed increasingly timid. Thus, the Chinese agenda in Brussels was not primarily driven by hopes for substantial Western concessions. Instead, the delegates had been tasked by Nanjing to anticipate the post-conference landscape and to actively seek ways to encourage Europe and the Americans to support Soviet military action against Japan. China, long reliant on Germany as a diplomatic partner, increasingly felt betrayed, not just by Germany, but also by its fascist ally, Italy. Consequently, it began looking more favorably upon the Soviet Union, Japan's arch-rival in Northeast Asia, as its main source of international support. The Soviet Union exhibited a firmer stance than the Western democracies at the Brussels conference, joining China in advocating for a collective security in Europe and Asia. On November the 15th, a small group of officers from the 10th Army gathered for late-night discussions in an abandoned building north of Hangzhou Bay. There, they would effectively decide the fate of China. Yanagawa Haisuke, the commander of the 10th Army, presided over the discussions. Fresh from the battlefield since the beginning of the month, he was eager to escalate the fight, a sentiment echoed amongst many of his colleagues. It was an unusual meeting, where officers as low in rank as major were making decisions typically reserved for the highest echelons of political power. The agenda included a pivotal question. Should they adhere to the recent Order Number 600, received from Tokyo a week prior, which instructed them to halt their advances along a line from Suzhou to Jiaxing? Or should they disregard these explicit orders and push forward to seize Nanjing? While the Japanese army had failed to completely annihilate the Chinese forces around Shanghai, there was a consensus that their adversary was now reeling from the recent setbacks, presenting an opportune moment to strike decisively and secure a swift victory. The only remaining question was how aggressively to pursue said goal. Colonel Terada Masio, a senior staff officer within the 10th Army, spoke first. The Chinese army is currently retreating towards the capital. We should cross that line and pursue the enemy straight to Nanjing. Major Iketani Hanjiro, a staff officer recently attached to the fast-moving 6th Division, then offered his input. From a tactical perspective, I completely agree with Terada, and we should cross the line. But the decision to attack Nanjing should be considered not just tactically, but also politically. It's not that field commanders can't create a fait accompli to pressure our superiors in Tokyo. However, we must proceed with great caution. Another staff officer raised this question. What if Tokyo orders us to pull back those smaller units? Iketani responded, In that case, we will of course withdraw them to this side of the line. Ultimately, Iketani's cautions were actually set aside, and Terada's aggressive approach prevailed. The majority agreed that the tactical circumstances presented a rare opportunity. Japanese troops in the Shanghai area were poised to advance west, not through small individual skirmishes, but with a substantial deployment of their force. Officers estimated that if a decisive push was made immediately, Nanjing could fall into Japanese hands within just 20 days. However, Colonel Kawabe Torashiro, the newly appointed chief of the Army General Staff Operations Section, suddenly arrived at the theater. He was specifically sent on a mission to assess whether the Central China Area Army should be granted greater operational freedom. It was well known in Tokyo that field officers were eager to capitalize on the momentum created by the collapse of the Chinese defenses around Shanghai. Kawabe's task was to explore the possibility of allowing forces to cross the line from Suzhou to Jiaxing and move westward in pursuit of the retreating enemy. However, Kawabe was staunchly opposed to further military adventures in China. Kawabe was part of the dwindling faction known as the China Doves within the Japanese military. As early as September of 1937, he had become alarmed by a letter from a civilian Japanese visitor to the Chinese mainland, warning that Japanese officers were attempting to engineer another incident within China to provoke open conflict. This would provide Japan with a pretext to expand its influence into northern China. Kawabe had attempted to alert his superiors, but his warnings fell on deaf ears. They had been lulled into a false sense of security by reports from China that dismissed all talks of warmongering as baseless and alarmist. When he first arrived to the front, he stated, I am here to inspect conditions on the ground, so that a final decision can be made on where to establish the operational restriction line. Alongside him came General Akira Muto, recently appointed the commander of the Central China Area Army. He also happened to be one of the architects of the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Muto responded promptly. The line currently stretches from Suzhou to Jiaxing, but we should consider crossing it. This will help us achieve our overall objectives in the theater. Muto continued, arguing that the 10th Army should be permitted to advance to Huzhou, south of Lake Tai, effectively cutting off communications between Nanjing and the strategic city of Hangzhou. He further claimed that the Shanghai Expeditionary Force should be allowed to capture the vital city of Jiangyin, suggesting perhaps over-optimistically that its loss could lead to the entire fall of Chiang Kai-shek. Ultimately, Muto insisted Nanjing should also be seized, which he asserted would bring an end to the war. Kawabe listened patiently, a practice he would repeat in the following days as other field officers echoed similar sentiments, eagerly expressing their desire to advance all the way to Nanjing. Yanagawa and his 10th Army exemplified this aggressive mindset. Nevertheless, just as the hawks within the Japanese military and the nation's political leadership appeared to be prevailing in their struggle over the China policy, they faced unexpected challenges from a very different direction. Germany, a power with ambiguous sympathies in East Asia, was quietly engaged in negotiations aimed at bringing a peace. Oskar Trautmann, Germany's ambassador to China, had maintained an objective and neutral stance when he met with Chiang Kai-shek in early November to relay Japan's conditions for initiating peace talks. These conditions included extensive concessions in northern China, such as the withdrawal of all Chinese troops to a line south of Beijing and the establishment of a pro-Japanese regime in Inner Mongolia, bordering the Soviet-controlled Mongolian People's Republic. Chiang dismissed these demands outright, but Trautmann and his superiors in Beijing continued their top-secret efforts. Germany's motivation for seeking an end to the Sino-Japanese War was not rooted in any genuine love for peace, but rather their embarrassment over witnessing their old Asian ally, that being China, fighting against their new partner, Japan. Basically, Germany was between two girlfriends. Hermann Göring, president of the Reichstag and the leading figure in the Nazi Party, told a Chinese visitor, "China and Japan are both friends of Germany. The Sino-Japanese War has put Germany between Scylla and Charybdis. That's why Germany is ready to seize the chance to become a mediator." Germany also feared that a prolonged conflict in China could jeopardize its commercial interests in East Asia and weaken Japan's capacity to confront the Soviet Union, potentially freeing Moscow to allocate more resources to fight in Europe. In essence, continued hostilities could significantly harm Germany. Japanese field commanders were really frustrated by Germany's mediation efforts. When news of Trautmann's mission leaked, the German diplomat faced severe criticism in Chinese media, which deemed any negotiations with the Japanese devils unacceptable. Additionally, there was the matter of China's ties with the Soviet Union. Employing a German mediator raised the possibility of cooperation amongst China, Japan, and Germany, potentially expanding the anti-Soviet bloc, which would in turn pressure Moscow to increase its support for China. By mid-November, however, the complexities of this diplomatic game started to unravel, and then Japan took action. At 7 a.m. on November the 19th, Yanagawa issued instructions to his troops in the field. The enemy's command system is in disarray, and a mood of defeat has descended over their entire army. They have lost the will to fight. The main Chinese forces were retreating west of the line stretching from Suzhou to Jiangxing, and this withdrawal was soon likely to spiral into a full-scale retreat. We must not miss the opportunity to pursue the enemy to Nanjing. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Please, if you have a chance, go check out my latest episode titled Operation Shahar, and comment where you came from. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is going to be like 32 episodes and ongoing by this point, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Shanghai has fallen, and the Japanese forces are pursuing their fleeing enemy further west. However, they have orders to halt. But will they? Officers from the top down deliberate on the issue, with the vast majority saying that they should push on to Nanjing. They thought it represented the end objective of the entire conflict. They would be very wrong.